There's a small detail in the very first season that most people file away without thinking about. Rick Grimes wakes from a coma into the end of the world, makes his way to Atlanta, and finds his family alive in a quarry camp outside the city. And within just a few episodes, his sheriff's hat, that wide-brimmed symbol of everything he used to be, is on Carl's head. Not on Rick's, on his son's. A child wearing a father's authority like a costume, still performing safety in a world where safety ended long ago. That hat stays on Carl's head for most of 8 seasons, through Dale's death, through Laurie's, through a surrendering teenager Carl didn't really have to shoot, through a bullet that cost his eye, and a bite that cost everything. Was Carl the show's greatest hope? Or was he quietly its hidden cost? Let's find out together. The question at the centre of tonight's theory isn't comfortable. It's not the kind of thing you'd say out loud at a Walking Dead watch party, because it cuts against everything the show wants you to believe about Carl Grimes. The show wants you to believe Carl is the reason. He's the reason Rick kept going when everything else fell apart. He's the reason the group held together through the farm and the prison and the road in Alexandria. He's the reason the show had a moral argument at all during its middle seasons. This idea that surviving the end of the world means nothing if you lose the part of yourself that makes survival worth anything. Rick says it plainly across many seasons and in many different forms. In season 2 on the road and at Herschel's farm, when the group debates whether to vote Randall off the island, the conversation always loops back to Carl. What world are they making for him? What kind of man will he become if they make the wrong call? The group's ethics debates, and the show has a lot of them, especially in seasons 2 and 3, are constantly triangulated through this child. His presence at the edge of every significant moral decision functions as the group's conscience check. Can we justify this choice to Carl? Will this make his future possible? That's a lot of structural weight to place on one character. And here's what I want to sit with tonight. What happens when a story puts that much weight on a single person, and then that person's choices start costing other people their lives? Because that's what the evidence suggests when you lay it out carefully. The show built Carl as the moral North Star of Rick's world, the stated reason for nearly every significant choice Rick makes across 8 seasons. And at the same time, quietly, through specific episodes and specific decisions, it shows us that Carl's existence and Carl's choices carry an unusually high price tag. Tragedy doesn't just happen to Carl, tragedy happens because of Carl. Around Carl. In the specific orbit of Carl's curiosity, and Carl's choices, and Carl's unpreparedness for what the world actually is. I'm not saying Carl is evil. I want to be careful about that from the beginning. This theory isn't an argument that Carl Grimes is a villain, or that he makes bad choices through malice. He's a child. He makes the choices children make. Impulsive, curious, driven by the need to prove something to a father who keeps treating him like the person who needs protecting, rather than the person who can help protect. What I'm saying is that the show placed extraordinary structural weight on Carl's survival and Carl's meaning, and that wherever that weight pressed against the story, people died. The hat is where all of this starts. Rick's sheriff's hat, that tan, wide-brimmed thing that is both completely impractical for survival and somehow always present, moves from Rick's head to Carl's head early in season 1, and doesn't really come back. It becomes Carl's, which is interesting symbolically, because the hat is Rick's authority. It's his identity before the apocalypse, the physical reminder of who he was and what he believed about law and order and the structures that hold communities together. When Carl wears it, he's wearing his father's identity before he's formed his own. He's performing a version of his father that he hasn't earned yet. And the show tracks, across 8 seasons, what it costs to wear something you haven't grown into. The pattern I want to trace tonight runs from the farm, through the prison, through Alexandria, and all the way to a bite Carl gets while helping a stranger named Sadiq in Season 8. It's a pattern of good intentions with catastrophic radius. A child who means well, in a world that responds to good intentions with the particular brutality this universe reserves for hope. Carl's death in Season 8's mid-season finale is the most controversial creative decision in the franchise's later run. Chandler Riggs publicly expressed shock. His mother posted about it. Fans felt genuinely betrayed. But what if the show had been building to it all along? Not consciously, not as a planned statement, but because the structural role it gave Carl made his death the only honest conclusion to the argument it was accidentally making. Let's count what Carl's choices actually cost. And who paid the bill? Season 2 is the season the show finds its voice. For better and worse, it's the season of Herschel's farm, of the seemingly endless search for Sophia, of the group learning that the world they thought they could rebuild was already further gone than anyone wanted to admit. And it's the season that contains one of the most quietly damning sequences in the entire Walking Dead run, a sequence that most people remember as that time Carl should have stayed in the house, but that deserves more serious attention than the meme gives it. Let's go to Season 2, Episode 11, Judge, Jury, Executioner. The group is debating what to do with Randall, a young man they've captured and now need to either release or kill. Dale Horvath, the show's appointed moral voice, the character the writers use to articulate the ethical stakes of every significant choice, is making the case that the group shouldn't execute Randall in cold blood. Dale goes around to every member of the group, individually, trying to build a consensus, trying to hold the line on what kind of people they're going to be. It's an exhausting effort. It mostly fails. But Dale keeps going, because Dale believes, in a way nobody else quite manages to sustain, that civilization is a choice you make every day, and that stopping makes it harder to restart. Meanwhile, Carl wanders off. He finds a walker stuck in the mud at a nearby swamp. Half submerged, immobilized, unable to reach him. And Carl does what Carl does in Season 2. He pokes at it. He taunts it. He throws rocks at it, gets closer than he should, reaches out with a stick to prod it, drawn by that specific mixture of morbid curiosity and the need to prove he's not afraid that defines him through this whole period. The walker isn't going anywhere. Carl isn't in danger, or doesn't think he is. He eventually backs away. But the walker, in its struggling against the mud while Carl was taunting it, has worked one leg loose. Not enough to follow Carl, but enough to matter later. That night, during the group's meeting about Randall, Dale makes one final plea. The group votes without unanimity to proceed with the execution anyway. Dale walks out into the dark fields behind the farm, alone with his disappointment, and the walker that Carl loosened finds him. The aftermath is brutal and immediate. Daryl performs the mercy killing, and in the morning Dale is gone. The person the show was using to hold the group's conscience together, gone directly because a child couldn't leave a trapped walker alone in a swamp. The causal chain here is clean enough that the show doesn't shy away from it. It's not subtle. Carl knows and the audience knows, and Rick knows what happened. Carl tells his father quietly in the aftermath, with the specific flat effect that he develops across Season 2 as a defense mechanism against feeling too much. Rick's response is to keep Carl close, to process his own grief, to move on. But Dale's death changes the group's moral trajectory in a specific and measurable way. Dale was the one character the show could reliably use to pump the brakes on Rick's worst instincts. He asked questions nobody else asked. He pointed out the cost of decisions that everyone else had decided to stop examining. Without him, the group's ethical debates get quieter, less rigorous, more likely to resolve in favour of expedience. rather than principle. The show uses Herschel in this role later, and then eventually Carl himself. But Dale in season 2 is irreplaceable in a way. Those substitutes aren't quite. And the hat sits on Carl's head through all of this. Through the taunting at the swamp and the morning after, and the quiet confession. A father's symbol worn by a boy who is learning the wrong lessons, or perhaps all the wrong lessons in the wrong order, because the world won't wait for a child to learn things at a child's pace. The hat that represents authority and hope, and the structures Rick used to believe in, is being worn by someone who hasn't understood yet that the things the hat represents have a weight you feel most clearly when something goes wrong because of you. Dale was the one person who might have slowed what the group eventually became. Carl's curiosity ended that possibility on a quiet night in a Georgia field, and the hat kept sitting on Carl's head, and the show kept calling him Hope. If Dale's death in season 2 is the first clear piece of evidence in tonight's theory, the first moment where Carl's specific kind of unpreparedness creates a measurable, downstream tragedy, then the episode immediately following offers something more complicated and more troubling. Season 2, Episode 12. Better Angels. Carl shoots zombified Shane. He saves Rick's life. The show frames it as Carl's coming-of-age moment, the scene where he finally becomes what the apocalypse requires him to be. It is framed, in the grammar of the episode, as a good thing. Here's what I want to sit with. I think it's more complicated than that. I think it might be the moment that costs the most. Walk through what actually happens. Rick and Shane have their confrontation in the field. The confrontation that's been building since the pilot, since Rick woke up and found Shane living with his wife and his son, since the two men's philosophies about what survival requires prove so deeply incompatible that only one of them could lead the same group. Rick kills Shane with a knife. Shane begins to reanimate because everyone who dies reanimates now, whether they've been bitten or not. A detail the group learns conclusively in this episode. And Carl appears. He's followed Rick out to the field and he's standing behind Rick with a gun aimed at what Shane is becoming. Rick turns. Carl fires. The walker that was Shane goes down. The show presents this as relief. Rick looks at his son and the scene carries the weight of something passing between them. Something about necessity, about Carl, understanding the world as it is, about the child becoming the kind of person who can do what needs doing. It's framed as a milestone, and in some ways it is, but think about what Carl is now, and what that makes Rick going forward. Before this moment, Rick is still trying to be the lawman. He's compromised increasingly. He's made choices that would have horrified his pre-apocalypse self. But there's still a version of the Rick Grimes who wore that hat professionally. The sheriff's deputy who believed in procedures and due processes and the idea that the right way of doing things mattered even when it was inconvenient. The moment Carl shoots Shane, that version of Rick is gone, because whatever Rick felt about killing Shane, guilt, relief, grief, the particular horror of doing something necessary that is also terrible, he now also carries the knowledge that his child stepped in to complete the act. Carl is not just exposed to Rick's moral compromises anymore. Carl has participated in them, has made one of his own, and Rick's response is to lean into it. The Rick Grimes of season 3 and beyond, the one who severs hands, who makes executive decisions about community membership through increasingly brutal tests, who says this isn't a democracy anymore. That Rick becomes possible because of the night Carl shot Shane, because Rick saw his son do what had to be done, and something about the proof that Carl could survive what survival requires broke the last of Rick's resistance to becoming what the apocalypse is asking him to be. The showrunner pattern across seasons 1 through 3 uses Carl deliberately as the hinge of Rick's moral arc. Every time Rick is about to cross a line, the show has established as significant, Carl is present. as witness, as reason, as the person whose existence justifies or condemns the choice. Frank Darabont's original vision for the show, and Glenn Mazzara's continuation of it, both use Carl this way. The child as the barometer of what survival is worth, the person Rick is ostensibly doing all of this for. But the barometer is not passive. It changes what it measures by being present. Carl watching Rick make moral compromises teaches Carl that moral compromise is survival. Carl participating in those compromises, shooting Shane, later shooting a surrendering teenager at the prison, doesn't just affect Carl, it changes the justification structure Rick uses. I do this for Carl becomes a reason to do anything, because Carl is now also doing it. The hat sits on Carl's head at the end of season 2, and it means something different than it did at the beginning. It stopped being a costume around the time Carl started making choices with real consequences. The weight of it was always going to land somewhere. And the question of where it landed, who paid for what Carl became, is what the next several seasons are quietly about. What version of Rick Grimes exists if Carl isn't standing in that field with a gun? That question doesn't have a comfortable answer. Season 3 is where the show starts keeping its receipts. The farm was about learning. The prison is about reckoning. And tucked inside the prison arc, between the fall of Woodbury and the governor's campaigns and the introduction of Michonne, is a single scene that the show doesn't dwell on, but never quite lets go of either. A scene that shifts Carl from child shaped by tragedy to something more uncomfortable and more honest. The specific moment unfolds across season 3's latter half. The prison has survived its most recent crisis. A group of Woodbury soldiers, young men, some of them barely older than Carl, conscripted from a community they thought was safe, have been routed. Most of them surrendered or retreated, and one of them, Jody, a teenager who dropped his weapon, is encountered by Carl. The boy, because Jody really is a boy, the same kind of person Carl is if Carl had grown up in slightly different circumstances, hands the gun to Carl. He's giving up. He's done. He wants to survive. Carl shoots him anyway. The show handles this with careful, deliberate quiet. It doesn't dramatise the aftermath. It doesn't give Carl a breakdown or an immediate reckoning. What it gives us is Herschel Green, the show's moral compass in season 3, in the way Dale was in season 2, a steady, thoughtful presence who insists on examining what the group does, rather than simply surviving it, confronting Rick about what his son did. Herschel's confirmed line lands with the weight of a judgment. Your son murdered that boy. The word matters. Herschel doesn't say Carl made a difficult call. He doesn't say Carl acted under pressure. He uses the specific word that means something beyond survival necessity. Murder. And then he walks away, and the show moves on, and Carl goes back to being Carl, the kid with the hat, the hope, the reason Rick keeps fighting. But what happened in that hallway stays in the structure of the story. Because Carl's flat effect after shooting Jody, not shaken, not visibly disturbed, just quiet in the specific way he has become quiet since shooting Shane and since shooting Laurie, is the show tracking what accumulation does to a person. Every time Carl has had to do something terrible, the show has noted that he doesn't fall apart afterward. He absorbs it, he incorporates it into whatever version of himself he's becoming. And by season 3, that version is starting to look like something the show doesn't entirely have a word for. Here are the 3 anchors in this chapter. The dropped gun on the hallway floor. Jody's gun, handed over in surrender, lying where it landed after Carl didn't need to use it because Carl shot him anyway. Herschel's face when he tells Rick, carrying the specific grief of a man who has tried very hard to believe in people and keeps being shown what people do when nobody's watching them closely enough. And Carl's flat effect in the aftermath, the absence of disturbance that is its own kind of disturbing, the sign of a child who has been through enough that the moral weight of killing, a surrendering teenager, doesn't register the way it should. The show keeps framing Carl as hope. It will continue to do so through season 3 and into the Alexandria arc. Rick keeps farming for Carl. Rick keeps building walls for Carl. The letters Carl writes before his death in season 8 become the show's moral statement about what all of this was for. But hope doesn't shoot surrendering teenagers. Or if it does, if hope in this world is something that has learned to kill teenagers in hallways without falling apart afterward, then the thing the show is calling hope is not quite what we thought it was when Rick first put that hat on his son's head. The tragedy is that Carl wasn't wrong, exactly, in any individual moment. He's been trained by what the world is. He's been conditioned by every choice the group made around him, and every choice he was forced into, and everything he was asked to absorb too young. The prison kid is the receipt for all of that. And the show doesn't tear itself up over it. It moves on. The hat stays on. And the question of what Carl is becoming stays in the background, unresolved, accumulating interest. There's a scene in season 3, episode 4, Killer Within, that most people identify as one of the most emotionally devastating hours this show ever produced. And it is. Laurie Grimes dies in childbirth in the prison's boiler room, with Maggie performing an emergency cesarean section without proper equipment, without any real option for saving Laurie's life while also saving the baby. Judith is born, Laurie dies, and Carl, who is present, who has been there through all of it, is the one who shoots his mother to prevent her from reanimating. The show places this on Carl deliberately, and the deliberateness matters. Maggie could have done it. The show could have found another way. Instead, it gives Carl a task that no child should have, frames it as necessity, and then watches what Carl does with it afterward. What Carl does is go quiet. He doesn't cry in front of anyone. He doesn't have the visible breakdown that might have made the audience feel the full weight of what he's just done. He comes out of that boiler room, and he is already somehow on the other side of it, already having processed it into whatever he's becoming. Rick's response to Laurie's death is the inverse of Carl's. In Say the Word, and the episodes immediately following, Rick dissolves. He goes to the boiler room, finds her gone, finds evidence of what happened, and starts screaming in a way that is genuinely frightening. A man unravelling in real time, grief breaking him open in public, in front of his group and his son and everyone who needs him to be able to lead. He picks up a phone and starts talking to dead people. He hallucinates Laurie in the prison grounds. He is completely, functionally non-operational as a leader for an extended period. Carl is not. And this is where the show's doing something more complicated than it gets credit for. The contrast between Rick's visible grief and Carl's internalised version is not an accident. The show is tracking two different responses to the same loss and suggesting quietly that Carl's response is the more alarming one. Not because he doesn't feel it. Of course he feels it. He's a child who just shot his own mother. But because he has already learned by season 3 that feeling things visibly is a vulnerability he can't afford. He is 10 years old and he already understands the apocalyptic calculus that grief is dangerous because it slows you down. The hat is on his head through all of this, through the boiler room and the aftermath and the days that follow. A father's symbol worn by a boy who is doing a man's worst work and doing it without the permission to fall apart that Rick takes for himself. There's something in that image. Carl in the hat, flat and functional, while Rick screams on the phone to a dead woman. That tells you exactly what the show has done to this child. Rick gets to be human in his grief. Carl has been made into something that can absorb the shooting of his mother and keep moving. And here's the pattern that I keep returning to when I sit with season 3's emotional architecture. Every act of terrible necessity that the show places on Carl, shooting Shane, shooting Laurie, eventually shooting a surrendering teenager, gets absorbed into his internal landscape in ways that don't dissipate. They compound. Rick processes his grief loudly and then eventually recovers enough to function. Carl doesn't process it at all in any way the show lets us see. He just becomes increasingly capable of doing what needs doing, with decreasing visible resistance to the doing of it. Rick fell apart visibly after Laurie died. Carl didn't. And that contrast, the adult breaking where the child doesn't, is either the show's most honest observation about what happens when you raise a child in an apocalypse, or it's the show quietly demonstrating that the cost of making Carl capable of survival has been the erosion of the specific quality the show claims makes his survival meaningful. If hope is what Carl represents, and hope has learned to absorb shooting its mother without public grief, then the thing we're calling hope has already become something else. The hat stays on. And the question of what it's covering gets more complicated with every episode. No Way Out is one of the show's most technically accomplished episodes. The Walker herd invasion of Alexandria, the gut poncho procession through the streets, the chain of events that cost the Anderson family everything. And it's remembered, rightly, as one of the best hours the show ever produced. It's the episode that finally makes Alexandria feel real, makes the stakes feel like stakes, makes Rick's group and the original Alexandrians into a single community through shared crisis. Season 6, Episode 9. It has earned its reputation. But let's look at what the episode actually costs. Because the show presents it as a triumph. Rick carrying Carl through the herd, Carl surviving, the community uniting around his survival, Rick's grief converting into a furious, inspired decision to fight for Alexandria rather than simply endure it. The framing's unmistakably hopeful. Carl's survival catalyses something real and positive in Rick and in the community. That's all true, and it matters. The cost, though, is 3 lives. Sam Anderson, who freezes in the herd and calls out in the dark, attracting walkers to his position. Jesse Anderson, who is pulled down while the group watches, and who cannot release Carl's hand, even as she's dying. Ron Anderson, who watches his entire family die in under 2 minutes, and, with Michonne's sword already through him from behind, fires at Rick in a reflex action. And the bullet meant for Rick takes Carl's eye instead. 3 people, an entire family. Gone in a sequence that starts with Sam's paralysis in the herd. And the chain that leads to Sam's paralysis runs in part through Carl. Not directly. Carl didn't cause Sam's anxiety or Alexandria's sheltered failure to prepare its residents for reality. But Sam's specific terror, the visceral paralysis that locks him in place at night, was seeded partly by his relationship with Carl and the exposure to a boy who moved through violence with a flat affect and a steady hand. The contrast between what Carl had become and what Sam was, a genuinely traumatised, unprotected child who had watched his abusive father executed in the street, was always going to produce something like this. The 3 anchor moment sits in the darkness of that street sequence. The gunshot, Ron's reflex, the bullet finding Carl's eye in the dark, Rick carrying Carl through the herd immediately after, his son limp in his arms, the urgency of the run through the dead carrying the specific terror of a father who cannot process what just happened while also needing to keep moving. And then the bandages, afterward, the empty socket under white gauze, the thing Carl will carry visibly on his face for the rest of his life. The mark of the night Alexandria was saved, and 3 people died, and the show called it a victory. I don't want to be reductive about No Way Out. It is a great episode. The community building that follows, the choice to fight for Alexandria, the united defence, the moment that transforms Rick's relationship to the people around him, is genuinely earned. Carl's survival matters to the story in ways that resonate forward. But here's what I keep coming back to when I sit with the accounting. 3 people died so that Carl could live through that night. Not through malice, not through anyone's bad decision, through the specific cascade of circumstances that surrounds Carl's existence in this universe. His presence pulling Sam into a friendship that exposed Sam to a version of survival Sam wasn't equipped for. The Andersons' deaths following from Sam's exposure to a world Carl navigated and Sam couldn't. The bullet finding Carl as the final cost of a sequence that started with 2 boys who had no business being friends in an apocalypse, trying to be friends in an apocalypse anyway. The show calls it a victory. Rick is galvanised. Alexandria is unified. Carl survives. And 3 people who didn't plan to die that night are gone. The hat is still on Carl's head when Daryl's motorcycle brings the fuel that saves the town. 3 people died so Carl could live through that night. The show calls it a victory. It is worth asking quietly whether it fully feels like one. Let's talk about the decision that ended Carl's story, because understanding it, what the show did, why it was so painful, and what it reveals about the structural role Carl occupied, is central to the theory we've been building all night. Season 8, mid-season. Carl is bitten, not in a fight, not in a moment of recklessness or poor judgment. He's bitten while helping a man named Sadiq, a stranger he encounters on the road and decides to assist against a cluster of walkers. Sadiq's mother believed that killing walkers freed their souls, and Sadiq has been fighting them in her memory. Carl joins the fight because it's the right thing to do. Because this is who Carl has spent 8 seasons trying to become. The person who chooses to help strangers, who extends the circle of the group outward, who practices the world his father is supposed to be building. And it kills him. The bite is on his torso. The revelation comes in the mid-season finale, where Carl lifts his shirt in the sewer and shows the group what happened, and the episode and the entire arc shifts around this information. Andrew Lincoln's performance when Rick understands what he's seeing is one of the finest things he does across the entire run of the show. The grief in it is total and immediate. Carl's death, which occurs in the subsequent episode Honor, Season 8's 9th episode, is the most controversial creative decision the franchise made in its later years. And the controversy wasn't just fan unhappiness at losing a character, it was the specific way the decision was made. Chandler Riggs, who played Carl from the age of 10 across 9 seasons, has spoken publicly about learning of the decision. His mother posted about it at the time, expressing the family's feelings with the directness that the internet immediately noted. Scott Gimple, who made the decision as showrunner, has said he believed Carl's death was the right narrative choice, that it created the conditions for the story he wanted to tell about Rick and Negan, and the shape of the war's aftermath. But here's what Carl leaves behind. Before he dies, he writes letters, 2 of them that the show places significant weight on. 1 to Rick, 1 to Negan. In the letters, read across the Season 8 finale Wrath and its surrounding episodes, Carl describes the future he wants. A world where Negan lives. A world where the communities find a way to coexist rather than destroy each other. A world that is worth surviving into, not just surviving through. And then the show spends 3 more seasons trying to build that world without Carl in it. The hat passes to Judith. Literally, visibly, the show makes this transfer explicit. The physical inheritance marking Judith as Carl's successor in the structural role Carl occupied. The show is acknowledging, in the grammar of its own symbolism, that the thing Carl was carrying needs to be carried by someone else now. And here's the specific detail that sits at the edge of this chapter. Sadiq survives Carl's death. He integrates into the communities. He becomes a doctor. He is present through seasons 9 and 10, carrying the story forward, living the life that Carl's help made possible. And then the show kills Sadiq too. Season 10, Episode 8, The World Before. Dante, an infiltrator, kills Sadiq in a way that is abrupt and brutal, and that lands as one of the grimmer pieces of business the show conducts during the Whisperer arc. What does it mean that the person Carl died helping also dies? I don't think the show is saying Sadiq's death was Carl's fault, or that helping was wrong. But I do think the show keeps demonstrating, across its full run, that the radius of consequence around Carl's choices is unusually large and that the consequences don't stop when Carl does. Sadiq carries the cost of Carl's goodness for years, and then the show takes him too. The hat is on Judith's head now. The cost is still accumulating somewhere, and the question of what Carl's sacrifice actually bought is one the franchise is still in the process of answering. Season 8's finale, Wrath, contains one of the most structurally unusual sequences in the show's run. Rick is in the field facing Negan, and just before the fight resolves, just before Rick slashes Negan's throat and calls for Sadiq to save his life, and makes the decision to spare him, the episode gives us a flash forward. Old Rick, white hair, slightly bent but present, clearly decades older than the man standing in the field. A community thriving. Judith as a small child. Flowers. Birdsong. The specific visual grammar of peace. Of the thing that this whole 8-season war was theoretically being fought for. That vision is Carl's, not Rick's in origin. Carl described it in his letter. Carl articulated the future. Not just that Rick should survive, but what surviving should look like, and what it should produce. Rick's flash forward in the Season 8 finale is the visual rendering of a dead child's dream. The show is structuring its climactic moment around what Carl wanted, and the specific choice Rick makes in that moment. Sparing Negan, sending him to a cell, beginning the long process of trying to build the world Carl described, is explicitly connected in the episode to Carl's influence. My mercy prevails over my wrath, Rick says, paraphrasing the road parable his mother told him in Season 7's Rockin' the Road, a line the episode frames as Carl's advocacy made audible. Here is the thing that has been sitting with me about this sequence. The show spent 8 seasons building toward a future that it was framing as Carl's future, the world where Carl grows up, where Carl becomes the person he's supposed to become, where the price of 8 seasons of survival gets paid back in something worth having. And then it killed Carl at the end of Season 8's first half, and used the back half of Season 8 to build a climax around Carl's vision of the world he no longer exists in. Carl describes the future. Carl does not get to live in it. Carl's letter is the most powerful thing Carl does in his entire arc. More than any single choice, more than any action sequence, more than the survival of any specific crisis. And it was written because Carl was dying. The Commonwealth arc, Seasons 10 and 11, is the show's attempt to build what Carl described. A community large enough to sustain real civilization. A society with infrastructure and economy, and the beginning of governance beyond emergency crisis management. When you watch the Commonwealth storyline through the lens of Carl's letter, it reads as the franchise's belated attempt to reach the destination Carl specified from a sewer in honour. The 3-anchor moment for this chapter sits in the weight of those letters. Rick's hands holding the paper in the Season 8 finale, / Judith reading her own copy, in a later episode / the empty space, in every frame of the post-Carl world where Carl should be standing, growing up, living the future he described. There's a reading of this, the more generous interpretation, that says Carl's death is the most thematically honest thing the show did. That's saying the future requires sacrifice, and then sacrificing the character whose whole purpose was to represent the future, is the show keeping its own promises. That Carl's vision outlasting Carl is the point. That hope is not a person, it's an idea, and ideas survive people. But there's another reading. that Carl's absence is precisely why the Commonwealth arc never quite delivers the feeling of arrival it was aiming for, that the world Carl described in his letter has a Carl-shaped hole in it that the show never fully fills, no matter how many seasons it spends trying. Judith is there. Rick eventually gets free and the ones who live. The communities endure, but the specific emotional weight of Carl's dream, the thing that made it feel like a destination rather than just a possibility, was Carl himself, and the show took him away before the journey finished, and then spent years navigating toward a destination it couldn't fully reach because the person who knew the way was gone, the future Carl described. Does anyone actually live it? Or does his absence make it permanently just out of reach? The hat is on Judith's head now. The dream is in someone else's hands, and the show's still trying to figure out if it can get there without the person who knew what getting there was supposed to look like. Here's the theory, stated as plainly as I can manage. Carl Grimes is not the curse of the Walking Dead because he was a bad person, or because his choices were worse than anyone else's, or because he consciously brought suffering to the people around him. The argument isn't that simple, and I don't think the simple version would be true even if it were satisfying. What the evidence points toward is something more structural, and in some ways more interesting, and in some ways more damning of the show itself than of its character. Carl was the load-bearing wall of Rick's emotional architecture. He was the stated reason for nearly every significant moral choice Rick makes across 8 seasons. He was the show's justification for its own thesis, the thing it kept pointing to when asked why survival matters, why the cost of all this horror is worth it, why the moral erosion of the group in service of making it through another season isn't simply a slow tragedy. Carl is why, the show kept saying. Carl is the future. Carl is what we're building toward. The evidence chain runs like this. Dale's death, caused by Carl's recklessness with a trapped Walker in Season 2's Judge, Jury, Executioner. The moral compass the show was using to check the group's ethical drift, gone, with Carl's footprint on the sequence. Shane's shooting, Carl pulling the trigger in Season 2's Better Angels, framed as coming of age but functioning as the pivot from Rick the lawman to Rick the survivor, a transformation the rest of the series cannot undo. Laurie's death, Carl performing the mercy killing, absorbing it without public grief, incorporating it into whatever he is becoming, in ways the show tracks across the next several seasons. The prison kid, Carl shooting a surrendering teenager in Season 3. Herschel looking at Rick and saying, "Your son murdered that boy," and the show moving forward without resolving what that moment means. Ron's bullet. The Anderson domino that cost 3 lives, and Carl's eye in Season 6's No Way Out, with the chain running through the orbit of Carl's friendship with Sam. Sadiq's rescue. The good deed in Season 8 that bites Carl and ends his story, and later costs Sadiq his life as well. The chain is real, and the pattern it traces is not one of a villain. It's one of a structural necessity the show couldn't sustain. Carl is load-bearing in a specific and costly direction. He supports the architecture of the story, while the story keeps taking casualties around his existence. Every time the show moves a piece forward for Carl, it removes something else from the board. A moral compass here, a family there, an eye. Ultimately Carl himself. My read, and I want to be clear, this is interpretation, not claim, is that the show never intended this. I don't think anyone in the writer's room looked at Dale's death in Season 2 and thought, this is the beginning of a pattern. I think the show was genuinely using Carl as hope, genuinely believed in what it was building toward, genuinely thought the accumulation of these losses was the price of a meaningful conclusion, rather than evidence that the thing it was protecting had become the source of the damage. The curse isn't malice, it's structure. The show built itself so completely around Carl's survival and Carl's meaning that every loss in service of that construction became part of the same pattern. And then Carl died anyway, and the pattern had nowhere to go except forward, into a future that couldn't quite find its shape without him. The show's greatest hope and its deepest wound are the same person. Not because Carl chose to be that, not because anyone planned it, but because that's what happens when you place enough narrative weight on a single human being. The weight becomes its own kind of gravity, pulling everything in the story toward it, and the radius of the pull gets larger with every season. Carl's death in Honor is the moment the show's load-bearing wall fails, and the rest of the franchise is the building trying to figure out how to stand without it. Now, I want to push back on the theory we've been building, because the counter-argument is essential, and, in some ways, more moving than the theory itself. The counter-argument is this: Carl wasn't the curse, Carl was the counter-curse, and his death removed the last functional check on what the world of this show was making of its survivors. Think about what Rick Grimes looks like without Carl, not in a moment of loss. We see what Rick looks like in a moment of loss, in Season 3's phone calls and hallucinations, and the weeks of barely functional leadership that follow Laurie's death. I mean structurally, as a character, across the full run of his story. Who is Rick when Carl is not present as the stated reason for every choice? The answer the show gives us, in its own evidence, is not reassuring. The governor is what a leader looks like when the last connection to a child's future is definitively severed. When Penny, his zombified daughter, is finally taken from him, he becomes purely destructive. Shane is what Rick might have been if Rick had moved through the apocalypse without Carl as his anchor. A man whose survival logic eventually consumed his ethics entirely. Every character on this show who loses the specific connection to a child, to a future self, to the thing they're protecting, rather than simply surviving for, trends toward the same endpoint: survival without purpose, which in this universe looks a lot like the governor's fish tanks and Shane's jealous spiral. Back in Season 4's first episode, 30 Days Without an Accident, Rick Grimes is farming. He's set aside his gun. He's growing vegetables inside the prison fence, while Carol teaches the children combat skills he's chosen not to be involved in. He's trying to be something that resembles a normal father in a world where normal fatherhood has been definitionally impossible for 3 seasons. And Carl is right there, annoying Rick about farming, wanting to name the pigs, doing the things that children do when they feel safe enough to be children. This is the closest Rick gets to peace across the entire original run. The proximate cause of that peace is Carl. The Season 5 Terminus arc shows what happens when the peace breaks. Rick is feral at Terminus. He bites Joe's throat in the dark, and afterward he says to Daryl, "That's not something you ever get back." Carl was watching, and Rick knows Carl was watching. The shame in that acknowledgement, the awareness that his son has seen him do something that costs something permanent, is one of the few levers the show has left to pull Rick back from the edge of becoming purely what survival requires. Carl's presence is the thing that makes Rick want to still be more than that. The seasons after Carl's death, Season 9 through Season 11, are, collectively, more morally grey than the seasons that preceded them. Not darker necessarily, not more violent, but more ambiguous about what the right call is in any given situation, less sure of what the story is arguing, less able to land on a thematic resolution with the clarity the earlier seasons could achieve because they had a stated reason to land there. Carl was the reason. Without Carl, the show knows what it wants to build: the Commonwealth, the future, the world Carl described, but keeps circling it without quite arriving. Some fans read Carl's death as the show's worst mistake and nothing else. Others read it as the show's most honest moment. The acknowledgement that hope is not a person, that it's an idea that survives people, that Carl's vision outlasting Carl is the point. I don't think either reading is entirely wrong. I hold both of them at the same time, which is perhaps the most honest thing I can say about it. Maybe the question isn't whether Carl was the curse. Maybe the question is whether hope always costs this much in this universe. Whether the show was saying, from the beginning, that the things most worth protecting are the things most at risk, and that the radius of their protection is the radius of their cost. Carl was worth protecting. And the cost of protecting him was the shape of the story itself, and the shape of what was missing when he was gone. After Carl dies, the show does something interesting. It doesn't abandon the structural role he occupied, it transfers it. Deliberately, visibly, with the hat as the marker of the transfer. Judith Grimes, the baby Laurie died delivering, the child Carl never fully knew in life, grows into the position her brother vacated, and the show seems to know it. She wears the hat. She carries Rick's Python revolver when she's old enough to carry it. She makes leadership decisions with the same instinctive moral clarity the show previously attributed to Carl. She is, in the grammar of the franchise, Carl's heir. Season 9's Stradivarius, the episode that reintroduces Judith as a speaking, active character after the time jump, establishes her new role with quiet efficiency. She's been keeping radio contact with survivors. She's been making judgment calls about who to bring inside and who to turn away. When she encounters Magna's group on the road outside Alexandria, she brings them home. When the adults question the decision, she makes the case for it with arguments they can't easily dismiss. She is Carl, transferred forward into a survivor who didn't carry his specific accumulation of damage going in. But here's the crucial difference. The show doesn't punish Judith for being in this role. The tragedies that accumulate around Carl's presence, the deaths, the cascading consequences, the costs that tonight's theory traces across 8 seasons, don't repeat around Judith in the same pattern. She makes decisions with large downstream consequences. She brings in survivors who create complications. She intervenes in situations where staying out would be easier. And she survives it. She keeps surviving it. The show has apparently decided that the structural role can be maintained without the structural curse. Why? My best reading, offered as theory, not confirmation, is that the show learned something from what it did to Carl, not explicitly, not in any documented showrunner interview, but in the craft, the decision to distribute the moral weight more evenly across the ensemble in seasons 9 through 11, rather than concentrating it in a single character, is visible in the structure of those seasons. No single person in the post-Carl run occupies the position Carl occupied. The Commonwealth arc has Daryl, Maggie, Carol, Judith, and Yumiko all sharing the burden of what the future is supposed to mean. Nobody carries the whole thing. Nobody is the load-bearing wall in the way Carl was. The Daryl Dixon spin-off extends this logic into France. Laurent, the child Daryl encounters and eventually commits to protecting, functions as the reason to keep going in the France arc, in ways that rhyme structurally with Carl's function in the main series. He is the child the story organises around. He is why Daryl stays in France rather than finding a boat home in the first 3 episodes. He is the future, in the local version of that argument. But the show distributes the meaning more carefully, gives Daryl multiple reasons and multiple relationships, rather than concentrating all of the narrative weight in a single child. The franchise seems to have identified the load-bearing wall problem and deliberately avoided repeating it. Which brings us back to the hat. Carl's hat on Judith's head is not just a symbol of inheritance. It's a statement about transformation. The hat started as Rick's authority, was worn by Carl as performance, and then as weight, and now sits on Judith's head as something chosen rather than inherited by default. Judith picks up the hat and the revolver, and the roll, but she picks them up after seeing what carrying them cost Carl. She carries them in a world that has already paid some of the price Carl paid, and is carrying the hat into territory he never reached. Judith surviving into the Commonwealth Ark and beyond suggests the show found a way, eventually, to let hope exist without destroying it, to maintain the structural role without the structural cost. But it took losing Carl to learn how. The hat is the same hat. What it means to wear it has changed entirely. And maybe that transformation, painful as the cost of it was, is the thing Carl was actually here to make possible. The seasons after Carl's death reveal something about the franchise that his presence had been partially obscuring. Not hiding, the show wasn't concealing anything, but Carl's structural centrality meant that everything orbited him, and when the orbit collapsed, the other elements of the story had to redistribute in ways that made certain things newly visible. The most significant of these is Negan, Carl's letter, the one delivered posthumously, the one asking Rick to spare Negan, the one that makes mercy prevails over wrath into a line with real weight rather than simply a rhetorical flourish, is the engine of Negan's redemption arc. The arc that starts in the season 8 finale, that runs through Negan's imprisonment in Alexandria, that eventually produces the character who fights against the Whisperers and forms an unlikely partnership with Maggie in Dead City. That arc is Carl's. Carl asked for it. Rick builds it because Carl asked. Negan eventually becomes something different, because a teenager who had every reason to want him dead chose instead to write him a letter, asking for his life to mean something. Consider what that means. Carl's death is the thing that makes Negan's redemption possible, not just in the plot sense, not just because Carl's letter gives Rick the emotional justification for sparing Negan in the field, but in the thematic sense. Negan's arc is about becoming someone who earns the mercy that was extended to him. He spends seasons not quite deserving it, not quite doing enough, not quite becoming the person Carl's letter imagined. And then slowly he does. Dead City shows us a version of Negan who is genuinely changed, who has something like a moral core, who is capable of the specific kind of loyalty the franchise associates with its most evolved survivors. Carl's vision made that possible. Carl's death made it urgent. The alternative reading, the more generous interpretation of everything we've traced tonight, is that Carl's letter is the most powerful thing he does in his entire arc, more powerful than any survival, any fight, any moral choice made in the moment, more powerful than the loss of his eye or the shooting of his mother or the years of absorbing terrible things without falling apart. The letter endures. Rick reads it. Negan reads it. The franchise is shaped by it across multiple spin-offs and years of storytelling. Carl is gone, but his vision is still actively directing traffic in the Walking Dead universe. The ones who live, Rick's return, his liberation from CRM captivity, his choice to come home, is built around finding the future Carl described. Rick is still trying to build Carl's world. The franchise is still trying to get there. Whether it's arrived is the open question. Some viewers feel the Commonwealth arc delivered, a functioning, imperfect, complicated society that gestures towards civilization. Others feel it arrived at the destination but couldn't quite make it feel earned without Carl there to receive it. Both readings are valid. The absence of the person who knew what getting there was supposed to look like is something you feel in the fabric of those seasons, even when you can't quite name it. It's the Carl-shaped space in the middle of a future he described but didn't live to see. Here is what I find most moving about the franchise's post-Carl shape. When I step back and look at all of it, the show went on. It built. It distributed the weight more carefully, gave Judith the hat and Daryl the meaning through a child, and Negan, a letter he's been living up to ever since. And somewhere in that continuation, in the choice to keep going, to try to build Carl's world without Carl, is the franchise's own version of Carl's argument. That hope is not a person. That hope is the thing people do after the person who represented it is gone. That the cost of Carl was real and enormous and irreversible. And the response to that cost was to keep going anyway, because stopping is not what Carl asked for. He asked for a world worth surviving into. The franchise is still in the process of answering that request. Come back to the hat. Come back to the first season, and Rick Grimes waking from a coma into the end of the world, and the wide-brimmed sheriff's hat that goes with him through Atlanta and to the quarry camp and onto Carl's head before we've quite registered the transfer. A child wearing his father's authority like a costume, still performing safety, in a world where safety has already ended. The hat has been with us through everything tonight, through Dale's death on the farm, with Carl's footprint in the sequence that led there. Through the night, Carl pulled the trigger on zombified Shane, and something in Rick's resistance to what the world was asking him to become broke open for the last time. Through the prison boiler room and the flat effect afterward, the boy who didn't grieve loudly, who absorbed and absorbed until the thing he was absorbing became part of his operating system. Through the prison hallway and the surrendering teenager and Herschel's face. Through the Alexandria streets and the darkness and Ron's bullet and the cost of 3 lives. Through the sewer in season 8 where Carl lifted his shirt and the story changed forever. And then the hat passes to Judith, literally, visibly, with the weight of everything it's carried made explicit by the transfer. Judith picks it up and puts it on and carries it into the Commonwealth Arc and beyond, and the show understands, in the way shows understand things through craft rather than explicit statement, that what she's wearing is not just headgear. It's the accumulated significance of everything Carl was asked to represent, and everything that representation cost. The hat started as a symbol of innocence performed, a child playing at being his father's heir before the inheritance was real. It became weight, the symbol of everything Carl was supposed to be, pressing down on a kid who got flatter and quieter, and more capable of terrible necessary things the longer he wore it. And now its legacy, worn by someone who didn't have to take it, who chose it, who picks it up with full knowledge of what wearing it has meant for the people who wore it before her. Carl never got to grow up, he got close. Closer than the show had the courage to let him arrive. He grew into someone interesting, someone who could have carried the story through to the future he described. And the franchise took him before the journey finished, and then spent years navigating toward a destination it couldn't quite reach without the person who knew what arriving was supposed to feel like. That is the cost, clearly named. That is the structural curse, not moral, but architectural. The show built a load-bearing wall and then removed it before the building was finished. But Carl's letters remain. Negan is still alive because Carl asked for it. Rick came home because Carl's world was still out there to come home to. Judith wears the hat and carries the revolver and keeps the radio on, calling into static, waiting for answers, building the civilization her brother described from a sewer in season 8. That is also true. Simultaneously, the curse and the legacy are the same thing, viewed from different angles, in the same light. The radio in Judith's hands is its own kind of motif. Rick used a radio to call for help in the pilot, the first act of the story, the proof that Rick was alive, the signal the camp couldn't receive. The franchise's spin-offs use radio as connection across distance. Daryl searching from France, Rick somewhere beyond reach, the communities calling to each other across the gaps. And Judith, hat on, radio in hand, calling into static, is the inherited version of that first transmission, still reaching, still waiting for an answer, still performing the act of hope in the specific way the family does it, through the insistence that someone is out there, that the connection is real, that the silence will eventually resolve into something. Was Carl the curse of the Walking Dead? Or was he the only version of the future it was ever really trying to find? I've been turning that question over through 13 chapters, and I don't have a clean answer. I think the most honest thing I can say is this: both. The show's greatest hope and its deepest wound are the same person, wearing the same hat, carried forward by a girl with a radio calling into the dark. The hat is still there, the signal is still going out. And whatever comes next, Carl's letter already said what it needed to say.